Okay, so I want to say just a few words about genre, since we're interested in exploring this idea of the novel in crisis and how does it respond to crisis. So we're thinking about the religious novel, and I'm going to be pulling some from a couple articles by DeWitt. So if you're interested in knowing, and DeWitt, so if you're interested in knowing more, I'm happy to pass those on to you, and we may hear about them next week too. What I'm primarily pulling from DeWitt is her, I'm quoting from her for some reviews that she pulls together for us. And I was really interested in her idea that genre is social construction, which I've come across before, but she was really thinking about it in terms of you look at these reviews that often talk about multiple novels at one time. This is in 19th century periodicals. And by creating associations and links between these novels that they review all at once, it creates a sense of a genre. And so she is arguing that's kind of how the religious novel emerged as a genre. It was people looking back, maybe just a few months or a couple years on these novels that were published and trying to understand what they were doing, and then noticing common links between them, common points of correspondence. So in DeWitt's words, she says, genre, in my findings, is not a process of development that moves forward in time, but rather a classification created retrospectively by readers seeking to make sense of a field of novels. And that retrospective perspective doesn't have to be very far. So as we will see from some of these reviews that are still 19th century reviews, but they are, again, kind of looking back at these cluster of novels and trying to understand them. DeWitt finds that Robert Elsmere was one of the most widely reviewed and discussed of all the religious novels, and that in some ways it becomes a point of reference for readers to incorporate other novels into this genre of the religious novel. So in some ways it's sort of setting the standard by which other novels would be grouped with it, and therefore those novels would also become religious novels. So I'm going to just read a few excerpts from some reviews. In 1888, in a periodical called The Independent, the reviewer says, "It is a year for religious novels. 4 of very especial individuality and power have seen the light, of which 2 at least have made themselves subjects for discussion far and wide." And the 4 novels he's talking about are Robert Elsmere, The Story of an African Farm, John Ward Preacher, which is an American novel and gets paired with Robert Elsmere all the time, and then Leon Roch, and so those are the 4 novels it's referring to. And then in particular, what this review says about Robert Elsmere was that it was, quote, a work of serious purport and scope, such as has not been brought to notice since the advent of a very different sort of religious novel, the John Inglesant of Mr. John Shorthouse, which I've never read. But again, DeWitt's point here is that every time these novels get talked about together, it creates a sense of, oh, this is a whole genre, and then certain elements that are deemed good and bad about that genre really emerges from these reviews. I also found that her collection of reviews that she quoted was helpful because it showed that there really was this sort of outpouring of novels dealing with different religious questions. For example, in the Unitarian Review, it says, within the last year, 1888, quite a swarm of theological novels written from the most opposite points of the religious compass have come forth to buzz about the ears of the public. And so theological novel was another term that came up a lot in the reviews. One critic in the Atlantic Monthly, again in 1888, sort of lamented the development of this religious genre and says, quote, he has an uneasy feeling as he witnesses the moral agony of Robert Elsmere that he must regard the books which record these experiences as contributions to theology and not merely as works of art. So again, a debate will emerge. Are these texts supposed to be religious dogma, or should they be considered art? And that's not a settled question by any means in the time period. In 1890, so a little bit later in the period, in the Leeds Mercury, an article or a review entitled "Theological Novels, Are They Desirable?" is answered by the author, no, they are not. And so often what you will find, DeWitt says, is that even if a specific novel like Robert Elsmere is spoken of in fairly complimentary terms, the review then will also turn to sort of deride the genre itself of the religious novel. And from what I can tell so far, it seems like the critique is often based on the fact that the reviewers sort of feel like the novel's trying to have its foot in two camps at one time, right? It's trying to tell a romance story and it's trying to talk a debate about religion. And it's just, the reviewers just don't like that combination, which I find a little curious, and I would have to do a little bit more digging about because having just done Martineau with you guys, she kind of launched much earlier in the period, in the 1830s, this idea of writing fictional stories about the economy. And she did have trouble getting that published at first. No one thought that people would be interested in that. And then they were widely popular, her kind of economic fictional stories. And so it kind of paved the way for this, kind of confluence of fiction plus some other kind of important issue like the economy. So again, I would be curious to know more about the discomfort that's expressed over those two. The other thing that DeWitt brings up, of course, is the idea of gender, and that often the texts that were most derided were written by women,